Steve Goldstein.
And I'm Rafael Carranza. We'll be co-moderating today's debate. The way we're sharing this debate is part of a brand new effort to support democracy in Arizona. Thanks to a partnership with the Clean Elections Commission, the Arizona Media Association, and Bitfire Studios, we're working to make sure these 2024 debates are the most accessible in Arizona history. That means this debate will air on a long list of local TV stations, radio stations, and digital platforms, including support from local newspapers.
And we've tried to keep the rules simple. Each participant representing a perspective about this proposition will have 2 minutes to make an opening statement and 1 minute for a closing statement. Participants have drawn straws to determine the order. Throughout the debate, Rafael and I will pose questions to each participant, allow them to answer, and then make sure the other debater has a chance to respond. Whenever a question is directed to a specific participant, only their microphone will be open. At all other times, every microphone will be open.
This debate will focus on Proposition 314, referred to the ballot by the state legislature. We want to start with a brief description of the proposition. On ballots, the official title of Proposition 314 is Relating to Responses to Harms at the Border. It's also called the Secure the Border Act. The official description reads as follows, quote, makes it a crime for persons not lawfully present in the United States to submit false information in applications for public benefits and employment, and to enter Arizona outside ports of entry or refuse to comply with orders to return, criminalizes selling fentanyl that causes the death of a person, end quote.
With that, let's introduce the parties who will be debating this proposition. Arizona Senator John Kavanaugh will be arguing for the proposition, and Arizona Representative Annalise Ortiz will be arguing against the proposition. Welcome to both of you. Thank you very much for being here. And for opening statements, we'd like to ask each of you to explain the measure and why you are for or against it. John Kavanaugh, you have the first opening statement, and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. President Trump, when he was president, was able to maintain pretty good operational control over our southern border. He primarily did this by passing a number of regulations, make it more difficult to game the immigration system. But most importantly, he introduced a stay in Mexico policy with the Mexican government, whereby people seeking asylum would have to wait in Mexico until their case was adjudicated, as opposed to coming into the United States, being given legal access, transportation around the country. Because it was harder to game the system, because people then would have to wait, the numbers of illegal crossings dropped dramatically. In fact, during Trump's last years, there were only about 50,000 illegal crosses a month. The first day that the Biden-Harris administration took office, they ended the stay in Mexico rule, and they also got rid of a lot of other rules that President Trump had instituted. The result was that the number of illegal crossings and gotaways exponentially increased. In fact, at one point, it was over 475,000 illegal entries and getaways in 1 month. The Biden-Harris administration is probably going to have about 10 million illegal people entering this country under their term. This bill attempts to address the problems caused by this tsunami of illegal immigrants. This is an extremely narrow bill targeted for some very specific problems, particularly people who cross the border illegally between entry points that are set up by the Border Patrol. These are the worst of the worst. These are people who have criminal records, people on a terrorist watch list, people who are transporting drugs, people who are human smugglers. They can't go to the legal border crossing where they would be interviewed and given status to enter. Instead, these people sneak in between the borders. Those are the people that we're trying to stop because they're dangerous to Arizona residents.
Okay, thank you. Annalise Ortiz, you have 2 minutes for your opening statement, please. Thank you.
I'm Representative Annalise Ortiz, and tonight I'm asking you to vote no on Proposition 314 because it's blatantly unconstitutional, a waste of your tax dollars, and will do nothing to actually secure the border. Prop 314 will implement a New York-style stop and frisk policy across the entire state of Arizona, turning every local law enforcement officer and civil servant into a federal immigration agent without giving them any funding or training to do the job. We could see churches and businesses raided. We could see children detained in cages. Prop 314 is SB 1070, the Show Me Your Papers law on steroids. Now, SB 1070 was struck down by the Supreme Court because it was unconstitutional. But during those dark days of Arizona history, we saw thousands of Arizona citizens have their civil rights violated, families separated, and taxpayers paying millions in litigation costs, we face boycotts of our state. Prop 314 will make our communities less safe because it will divert our limited local police officers to duplicate the job of Border Patrol. How many robberies and assaults in our neighborhoods will go uninvestigated? How many mixed status families will be afraid to call the police or come forward as witnesses to crimes? Now, we can all agree that our immigration system is broken. That's why the Biden administration negotiated the toughest border bill we've seen in decades, which was bipartisan, until Trump came in and told Republicans in Congress to kill it so he could campaign on this very issue. Prop 314 is nothing more than a cheap political distraction from what we actually need to do on the federal level. I'm not falling for it, and neither is the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, the Arizona Education Association, faith leaders, civic and law enforcement leaders from border communities who are all joined in opposition to Proposition 314.
Thank you for that. We'll begin the first question directed at you, Senator. In referring Proposition 314 to voters, state lawmakers cited Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution, describing the situation at the Arizona-Mexico border as an invasion that warrants greater action by the state. Do you believe Arizona is being invaded?
I do. I think anybody who has seen the footage of caravans of thousands of people making their way up to the border, it's undeniable that we have unprecedented waves of illegal immigrants crossing the border. It's not an invasion in the sense that it's an armed invasion, but there are thousands and thousands of people. In fact, by the end of the Biden-Harris administration, 10 million people would have come across the border. A large number of these people are bogus amnesty seekers. Not amnesty, are bogus seekers of asylum that don't qualify. So they are inundating us. But this bill is not a general immigration bill, as was suggested, and it's not 1070. This bill simply says that if a police officer has probable cause to believe that somebody's crossing the border, and that's a high standard, much higher than 1070's suspicion, probable cause to believe they're crossing the border, that person can be arrested, taken to a court, and then given an option, if they don't have a warrant out for their arrest, of leaving the country or facing prosecution. These people who cross between the legal entries, these are people who can't go to the Border Patrol and get legal status to enter. These are people who have previously been deported for serious crimes. They're people on the terrorist watch list. There have been documented apprehensions. They're people smuggling drugs like fentanyl, which are killing our children. And they're human smugglers, bringing in women for prostitution. These are the only people that we're targeting with respect to the police. Why would anybody not want to stop the worst of the worst? And the Border Patrol can't stop them. The wave of immigrants is so massive that the Border Patrol is overwhelmed just processing these people in, documenting them, and sending them across the country. In between the crossings, there's very little policing. That's why the worst of the worst, the dangerous people, are coming in. Public safety is our #1 priority, and that's why we have this bill to protect Arizona from these very dangerous people.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Ortiz, do you believe that there's an invasion at the Arizona-Mexico border?
It's just fundamentally not true that people who are crossing the border to seek asylum in this country are the worst of the worst, as Senator Kavanaugh put it. I have done ride-alongs with Border Patrol along the Texas-Mexico border, and I have met some of the people, families and children who are crossing into our country. They are they're fleeing violence in their home countries, they're fleeing persecution, and they are in a desperate situation where they are paying a coyote to get them to the United States by any means necessary so they can claim their right to asylum, which is their right under federal law. So when it comes to the flow of migrants and Border Patrol being overwhelmed, the Biden administration's bipartisan border package that was bipartisan until Trump killed it had additional funding for agents on the border who are specialized in this, right? What this is asking is for local police to do something that is entirely outside of their constitutional authority and enforce federal immigration law. That's why we had local law enforcement come testify testify at the state capitol, and they told me point blank, we don't have the resources for this. There's no funding attached to this. This is essentially unenforceable. And we even had Cochise County attorney, a Republican, say that this was bad public policy, completely unenforceable and embarrassing for this state.
Thank you.
Senator, I'm going to come to you with another definitional question, though you can, if you want
to reply.
You can have a 30-second reply. Sure.
Okay. Yeah. Representative Ortiz has totally misrepresented what I said. The families seeking asylum, they're the ones that go to the Border Patrol legal entries and they get processed.
That's not true.
They don't go in between the border and attempt to sneak through. The people who go in between the border are people who, if they presented at the Border Patrol station, would be rejected because of their criminal records. They're on the terrorist watch list. Or they won't go there at all because they're smuggling drugs or people. That's what we're going after.
No doubt we'll return to this over the course of the hour. I'll give you 30 more seconds to respond, then we'll move on to another question.
When we debate policy, we have to look at what the actual policy says. There is nothing in Proposition 314 that makes it so narrow that it would only target individual people. It would target anyone who is crossing the border or who's even been here for decades and could cause them to be arrested, detained, and potentially deported, including children and babies. There is nothing in the policy that says it would only apply to adults. We will see children in cages.
Senator Kavanaugh, 2 minutes for this next question. Definitional one. Language of the proposition under findings and declaration of purpose says, quote, due to weaknesses in immigration enforcement, a public safety crisis is occurring in Arizona, end quote. So I'll ask you a similar question where Ralph asked, but specifically, how are you defining a public safety crisis? As you said, this is not an armed invasion. You're saying it's an invasion. Sure. So how is it a public safety crisis?
Well, it's a public safety crisis because in between the crossings, and this bill specifically says, right, it only applies if they're not going through a legal entry. It's in between the land. That's in the law, so I do not know what Representative Ortiz is talking about. The cop has to have probable cause, which means he has to actually see the person crossing the border. So people in Maricopa County who came in years ago illegally, they aren't even close to this type of enforcement. But beyond that, why is it enforcement? 362 individuals since 2021 have entered the country and were identified as being on the terrorist watch list. 21,963 people in 2024 had criminal records who were apprehended. Many of them were gang members. They're smuggling fentanyl, which is killing our children. Gang members, terrorists, drugs to kill our children. If that's not a public safety crisis, what is? And I do not understand why Representative Ortiz and the rest of the opponents of this bill want the crossings, the area between the crossings, to be an express HOV lane for the worst of the worst.
Representative Ortiz, you have 2 minutes to respond.
It's pronounced Representative Ortiz, Senator Kavanaugh. And we want to talk about a public safety crisis in fentanyl. Fentanyl is impacting my community in Maryvale. And what the facts tell us is that over 90% of the fentanyl that is smuggled into the United States comes through those legal ports of entry smuggled by United States citizens. Therefore, if you continue to assert that Prop 314 only impacts outside of the ports of entry, it will do nothing to stop the 90% of fentanyl smugglers that are coming through the legal ports of entry. Now, what will protect us from the fentanyl that's coming through the ports of entry is the border package that is in Congress right now, because this is the job of the federal government. And we could allocate, and we should allocate, more money to making sure the ports of entry have updated technology, enough agent staff to be able to catch those illegal drugs that are coming through. But by trying to pin this on women, children, and families who are crossing the border is just absolutely a mistruth, and it's based in something that is wanting you to vote based on fear and not facts.
Senator Kavanaugh, you want 30 more seconds?
Sure. First of all, 90% may be coming through the border crossings, but that isn't just the port of entry. That also includes the roadblocks and blockades. So 90% is not just where they're entering, it's also roadblocks and roadways nearby. But that means 10% is not going through them. 10% is going in between the borders. Well, there were 17,000 pounds since 2022 of fentanyl, which could kill everybody in the U.S. 14 times. So if only 10% of that is getting through in between, that means that there's enough fentanyl that is being snuck in that will kill everybody 1.4 times.
Okay.
I don't think that is safe. I think any amount of fentanyl going in between the borders has to be stopped. It's killing our children.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator. And what to say with you, because we're going to talk about some of the costs, potential costs associated with the proposition. In 2004, Arizona voters amended the Constitution to require ballot measures to have a funding source to cover any financial costs. An analysis by the nonpartisan Grand Canyon Institute estimates that the cost of implementing some of the immigration provisions from Proposition 314 at least $325 million per year. Where will the money to cover many of these projected expenses to enforce Proposition 314 come from?
That is a bogus, absurd analysis by the Grand Canyon Institute. It is based on the assumption that every time a police officer apprehends one of these people entering illegally, rather than take the option, if they don't have warrants and they weren't previously apprehended, right, they will take the option, they will not take the option of going back across the border, but instead will say, no, I want to go to an Arizona prison. This law says that when they're apprehended, if they don't have warrants, if they didn't do it before, right, they have the option of being escorted out of the country. If they don't, and they're found guilty, then they go to prison. Let me ask you, how many people that are apprehended do you think are going to say, well, I think I'd rather spend 6 months in an Arizona prison rather than just leave? These prison costs are non-existent, except who will go to prison? The ones that had fentanyl, the ones that had drugs, the ones that have outstanding warrants because they committed felonies in this country before. And every penny spent to put those people in prison is money well spent because it protects Americans.
Thank you. Annalise.
Once again, Senator Kavanaugh is not speaking to you in the way that this bill will actually be implemented and in the reality of what happens on the ground, which is something that I know because I have done ride-alongs with Border Patrol and I have talked to migrants who have gone through horrendous situations on their journeys, many of them from Central America through Mexico and into the United States. Many of these folks, and part of the reason why the return to Mexico policy was so controversial was because in Mexico, they were faced with horrible exploitation, gang crimes, sexual assaults, all kinds of horrific things. And when it comes to having a stay in an Arizona prison or going back to those horrific, life-threatening situations in Mexico or in their home country, no one's going to go back voluntarily. That is just ridiculous. And the director of our Department of Corrections himself has said that this will cost the Department of Corrections $250 million each year on top of their $1 billion budget currently. We do not have the money to afford that as a state. We are in a budget deficit right now. And let me also make one thing clear. When somebody is detained, they will not be immediately released or have a chance to see a judge. There will be a period of incarceration pre-trial. And under this bill, it directs them to go to the Arizona state prisons, regardless of age, meaning the children, the babies, the toddlers who cross the border will be forced to be caged in the Arizona Department of Corrections, which is not suitable for children.
Senator, that goes to the next question because I do want to ask about the memo from the Arizona Department of Corrections. They issued that, they have concerns about, the space to hold them, including insufficient staffing and bed space to accommodate a potential influx of approximately 1,500 inmates per year, new inmates per year under this proposition. They anticipate reaching 100% of their total operating capacity by June 2027, according to this memo released earlier this year. What resources does Proposition 314 provide, or has the state legislature allocated to the Department of Corrections specifically to address these concerns?
We have already allocated for the budget year $56 million for border security and border enforcement. That money is available. But once again, these are worst-case bogus scenarios. Nobody is going to say, send me to an Arizona prison when they're given the option of being driven to the border and going back across. It's not going to happen. So this whole thing is a red herring that's being thrown out. In addition, I do not understand why Representative Ortiz wants to let people come in between the crossings. I mean, we should make it dangerous for criminals to come in between the legal border crossings to push these people to the legal crossings. Women with children shouldn't be trekking across the desert in illegal crossings. They should be directed to the Border Patrol where they will get food, medical care, legal entry, and they'll be able to be transported around the country, as opposed to being led in through a dangerous desert in between the crossings by a coyote. This makes no sense to me. I want to refocus because they're trying to make this sound like this is a general immigration bill that is going to be internal enforcement, SB 1070, controversy. That just isn't true. This is pinpoint targeted against those people who don't go to the legal entry points where they could go and be entered. And I said it again, I'll say it again. They're going in between because if they went to a legal entry point, they would be flagged. They'd be arrested because they have criminal warrants. They'd be rejected because they have criminal histories. They're on the terrorist watch list. Or they're just trafficking fentanyl or human smuggling, and they can't go to a border point. People should be going in legally, and women and children should be going through legally. And to suggest that we're sending women, that we're sending children to prisons is ridiculous. Everyone knows that never happened and never will happen. This is emotionalism trying to detract from the real purpose of this bill, which is public safety, focused like a laser.
Thank you, Senator. Representative, would you like to respond?
Mr. Kavanaugh just said it has never happened. I was just down on the Arizona border touring with Representative Sandoval and saw women and children detained by Border Patrol, and they were in facilities with the blankets and trying to keep themselves cool and trying to keep themselves entertained because there are still small babies, toddlers that are crossing the border. And under this law, they would be directed to an Arizona state prison. So it is not outside the realm of reality. Do not let Senator Kavanaugh make you think it is outside the realm of reality, because let me remind you, he was one of the sponsors of SB 1070, and he misled us with that bill as well. Now, I want to go back to something about people that are seeking asylum in this country. They, again, are in desperate situations, crossing potentially not at a legal port of entry because they are trying to get here by any means necessary. And the United States government does not make it clear to people who are fleeing persecution and violence what is the best way for them to come here. One of the other problems is that the vast majority of folks want to come here and wait out their fair day in court, which is their right under federal law to seek asylum and to wait and have their fair day before an immigration judge. Now, right now, that process could take up to 10 years we're talking about here. The bipartisan border package that the Biden administration negotiated in Congress would have reduced that time frame from 10 years to a maximum of 6 months. Again, former President Trump killed that deal because he wanted to campaign on this issue. I am not falling for that.
Thank you, Representative.
Once again, Representative Ortiz has brought up the so-called Schumer salvation bill, which would solve everything. The Schumer bill was a political ploy, and it would have made the situation far worse. The Schumer bill said that the president could only shut the border down if there were more than 5,000 illegal crosses a day. It would keep it open forever. The Schumer bill allocated $20 million for more Border Patrol agents, no wall security, and those Border Patrol agents would simply be processing the waves of new illegal immigrants who would be presenting with bogus asylum claims, because his bill also would give legal status to all the people who entered this country illegally. That's the signal that people all over the world are waiting for, to hear that if I sneak into this country, sooner or later, I'll get legal status. If we ever gave legal status to all the people who are already here illegally, we would turn on an electromagnet. You'd have 3 or 4 times the number of people swarming to our border, knowing now that they'll eventually get legal status. And then we would be totally overwhelmed.
Representative Ortiz, 1 minute, please.
That. You know, the vast majority of Arizonans agree that we need a balanced approach to immigration that takes into consideration the challenges on the border while also protecting dreamers and immigrants who have been in our community for decades. Our immigrant community, especially here in Arizona, they work hard. They pay their taxes. They are small business owners. They are our community members, our neighbors. They contribute $5 billion annually to our economy. People that have been here, have gone to school here, have started small businesses here, are the backbone of Arizona's economy in critical industries that already face labor shortages. And the majority of Arizonans agree that they deserve a pathway to citizenship. So we do need that balanced approach.
We need to move to a fresh question, Senator Kavanaugh. You have 30 seconds, and that's it.
Representative Ortiz wants to argue everything but Prop 314. This is not about immigration reform, not about dreamers. nothing to do with whatsoever. This is a bill that says there are very dangerous people who will not go through the legal port of entry and be screened because they are dangerous people. They're terrorists, they're prior deportees with serious felony records, they're drug smugglers, they're human traffickers. All we're doing is saying if a cop sees that person crossing the border, the cop stops them and prevents them from getting into this country. Not about dreamers,
Okay.
not about the people who are here.
Those
That's-
buzzwords
it's a
are
distraction.
nowhere in the
That
bill.
segues well into this next question I wanted to ask you, Senator Kavanaugh. Legislative Council analysis for Prop 314 says it would create at least 4 new state crimes. One that would keep an undocumented person from receiving public benefits. A second that would crack down an undocumented person who has knowingly filed false information in trying to get a job. A third that would punish someone for selling fentanyl. And another that would allow local law enforcement to charge a person who's come into Arizona illegally unless that person's been granted asylum. My simple question for you is this. How many state crimes do we need to add for this? Are there any state crimes already in effect that, as opposed to creating a brand new proposition, what's on the record could actually be enforced better?
Okay, well, first of all, these are not all new crimes. Fentanyl, it's already illegal to sell fentanyl. We're simply saying if you know it's fentanyl and you sell it to somebody and they die, you're going to get an enhanced penalty. If you kill somebody that way, it's like driving wildly drunk and killing somebody. You shouldn't just walk away with the drunk driving charge. So we want people to be held accountable for that. It's already a crime to present false documents in an attempt to get benefits. So what we're doing is we're saying that government agencies that give out benefits and financial aid have to run the person through the E-Verify system. And if they don't qualify, they're not arrested, but they don't get the benefits because taxpayers shouldn't be paying for benefits for illegal aliens.
Representative Ortiz, the Legislative Council does say 4 new state crimes. Do we need 4 new state crimes?
To answer your question, Steve, we don't have those state crimes as it relates to immigration right now because it violates the Constitution. It is outside of the scope of local law enforcement to enforce federal immigration law. That is why SB 1070, which aimed to do something very similar to Prop 314, was struck down by the Supreme Court. What is very important for people to recognize is that when we're talking about enforcing federal immigration law, we're talking about Border Patrol that has a specific range that they patrol along the U.S.-Mexico border. By making Prop 314 a state crime, people anywhere in the state could be arrested, detained, and potentially deported for being in the country without authorization or detained for simply being suspected of being in the country without authorization. That means we're going to see the civil rights of citizens and lawful residents violated. I think about my constituent, Sandra, who lives in Glendale for more than a decade. She's a small business owner, a mom, and a grandma. And she told me that during SB 1070, her son fled the state to New Mexico because he was so terrified of being separated from his young son and his wife. That is the kind of fear that is going to permeate our mixed status families once again. Those are the ugly days of SB 1070 and the reign of Arpaio that we do not need to return to. We are better than that as a state and as a community.
Representative Ortiz, since you alluded to those comments, I'll give you 30 seconds to respond, please.
Look, once again, Representative Ortiz is trying to scare people by misrepresenting what this bill does. This bill does not allow, this bill is not 1070, although, by the way, the section of 1070, which allows police, if they reasonably suspect somebody's here illegally, to detain them for ICE, that was ruled constitutional. We're not preempting the Constitution. We're not preempting federal immigration law. We're not saying anybody who feds say can come in shouldn't. We're simply saying we want to help the federal government. Local and state law enforcement has historically helped the federal government. When I was a cop, I went on raids with the DEA. It's nothing new to help the feds. We're all in this together because
Senator.
we all suffer from the danger and the expense of illegal immigration.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Ortiz, the federal government has claimed for a long time sole jurisdiction over enforcement of U.S. immigration laws. That includes the authority to arrest and deport migrants, as you spoke to earlier. If passed, do you believe that any of the provisions within Proposition 314 will hold up in court given a near certain likelihood that they will face lawsuits?
I think that I would hope that the provisions of Proposition 314 would be struck down once again by the courts. What worries me, Raphael, is that I believe my Republican colleagues are banking on the fact that we have a new Supreme Court, a more conservative Supreme Court, one that just dragged us back 50 years by overturning Roe v. Wade. They are trying to challenge this, but who's going to foot the bill for the constitutional challenges that are inevitably going to come? It's going to be you, the taxpayers. And when we talk about this costing an estimated $325 million a year for the taxpayer, that estimate does not include the inevitable lawsuits. We look at the racial profiling cases from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office that are now upwards of $300 million. That's money that could and should be going to our local public schools, to housing and health care. Let me remind you that we are crawling out of a budget deficit right now because of irresponsible fiscal policies passed by Senator Kavanaugh and his Republican colleagues. So this is absolutely unconstitutional. They know it, and they still want taxpayers to foot the bill for it. It's irresponsible.
Senator, again, given that challenge or the court
Yeah.
battles between local and federal officials, do you believe that the provisions within Proposition 314 will hold up in court?
Well, let me just first say, there will be no cost defending this law. The law, you have to read the law to understand it. The law clearly says that it's only effective if this law, the law in Texas or a similar law, is ruled constitutional and is enacted. So if the Texas law is ruled unconstitutional, this never takes effect. So there will be no cost of defending this in court. And in terms of cost, Representative Ortiz does a static analysis. But to the extent that this will deter illegal immigration, reduce crime, reduce unlawful benefits, how many hundreds of millions of dollars will we save in benefits we're not giving to them, in law enforcement costs, in hospital costs? Illegal immigration is extremely expensive, and if these people aren't in the country, we don't bear those expenses. So a dynamic analysis shows that this bill will save the taxpayer money.
Representative, I'll give you a chance to respond, but Senator, I want to ask you, since you brought up the Senate bill in Texas as well, that's currently being held up in courts at the moment. So because it is being litigated at the moment, why is this the right time to vote on Proposition 314, since there's a chance that it could not take effect until that's decided?
Well, for the same reason that in a ball game, the managers have a pitcher in the warm-up bin. If the Texas law is ruled constitutional, we want this to go into effect immediately, because we should not delay 1 second in protecting our citizens against drug smugglers, human traffickers, terrorist watch list people, and people who have been previously removed from this country and are coming back. It's about protecting people, and we want to be ready on day one to do it.
Representative Ortiz, 2 minutes.
The reason this is on your ballot this year is because it's an election year, and Republicans needed something to feed to their base. Knowing that this is unconstitutional, knowing that there is no funding attached to it, they want you to approve this border measure, and then they're going to hit you with the receipt later, which could cost millions, potentially even $1 billion. Don't fall for it. And since we brought up Texas, I do want to mention that a similar law that has already taken effect in Texas has cost their taxpayers upwards of $10 billion. And let's talk about the logistical nightmare here. I was a reporter along the Texas-Mexico border during a time that Governor Abbott had sent troopers, DPS troopers, to the border to duplicate the job of Border Patrol. And I broke a story that they wanted to keep hidden, by the way, of a trooper who fired his gun at a Border Patrol agent because he mistakenly thought he was a migrant. Those are the kind of terrible accidents that can happen when we do not provide the funding or training for local law enforcement to do this highly specialized job. Now, in that case, the Border Patrol agent was uninjured, but imagine if it could have been worse. Imagine if this was a child playing in Douglas or a grandma walking her dog in Nogales. This is not right for Arizona.
30 seconds, Senator.
Well, first, I'm not going to comment on the very cynical, mean-spirited suggestion from Representative Ortiz that we're running this bill to get votes on Election Day. This is a bill to protect citizens of Arizona. And in terms of injuries being caused by police enforcing the law, well, how many kids are going to be dead because people are smuggling fentanyl between the borders and we didn't apprehend them? How many women will be raped? How many women will be into prostitution through human smuggling? How many people will be assaulted? If you watch the news, it's happening all over the place, especially in big cities. 75% of the people arrested in Midtown Manhattan, according to NYPD, are these migrants. A lot of them are criminal gang members.
Okay, we'll cut you off there. Something both of you clearly want to discuss, and Senator Kavanaugh, I'll bring it up to you as one of the writers of SB 1070. Let's talk about, yes, there was a law that was passed. One of the provisions survived, as you mentioned, after the Supreme Court gave it a lot of scrutiny. But there are other dynamics involved with SB 1070. There was the reality of the law, but there was also the reality of perception becoming that reality across the country. And a lot of people were wondering, do I want to come to Arizona? Economically, that affects people practically, but also emotionally feeling unsafe, as Representative Ortiz referred to. Tell us again how this is going to be different from SB 1070, even in the perception aspect.
Well, this is already different because there is no outrage. There is no publicity. There are no picket lines. There are no threats. Nothing. During 1070, everybody was protesting, screaming. The media elites in Hollywood were talking about how horrible this is. For this bill, do you know what you hear? Crickets. And that's because this is not a roundup of illegal immigrants. This is nothing what is being represented by Representative Ortiz. This is a laser beam focused attempt to stop terrorists, human smugglers, drug smugglers, and people who have serious criminal records who have no business being in this country. And they don't want to talk about that. And to the extent that this is going to give us a bad reputation around the country, it will, because people like Representative Ortiz are blatantly misrepresenting what this bill does by claiming we're going to be going after people all over the state. We're going to put babies in prisons. And by the way, I said, show me, we've never put babies in prisons. You said we did. Please tell me when a baby's been in an Arizona prison as a prisoner.
Sir, you are talking about an Arizona state prison, which right now it is not their authority to enforce federal immigration law. They are being kept in the Border Patrol detention camps. But if this becomes law and a local police officer is forced to arrest somebody and send them to a state prison, which is written in the law, then we are going to have our first case of a baby in the Arizona Department of Corrections.
When parents are arrested, their children don't go to jail with them. Child Protective Services picks them up and puts them in foster care. This is another fabrication which you're creating to scare and confuse and obfuscate people.
Representative Ortiz, let's get back to SB 1070, though. You're feeling like this has shadows of SB 1070. Senator Kavanaugh says no.
Well, Mr. Kavanaugh was apparently not on the floor of the Senate, or maybe not listening when there were pleas from the gallery as this was being passed from organizers in the community who lived through SB 1070, many of them directly impacted by having family members picked up and deported, who said, please, please don't return us to the days of SB 1070. I prayed with faith leaders outside of the state Senate just a few months ago, asking, do not do this to our communities. I have constituents in my community in Maryvale regularly calling, asking, what's the deal with Prop 314? We don't want more racial profiling. We don't want the potential for our jobs to be impacted, for entire industries to have workers flee during what we already have as a labor shortage, which is what we saw during 1070. From the agriculture industry, hospitality industries, crucial industries to our state's economy. And so I would argue that perhaps he's not listening to the right people.
I'd like to bring it back to Proposition 314, if you mind, Senator.
Can I reply to a comment?
30 seconds, please.
40 people in the gallery of the Senate who are activists is not a nationwide uprising and revolt against what Arizona is doing. There is no massive reaction to this. And, you know, in terms of helping the community, when these criminals who sneak between the border, when they come in, they usually tend to victimize people of their own nationality because they tend to settle in those communities far more than other people. These drug dealers, these fentanyl people, they'll be victimizing people from their own ethnic communities. So very often, as far too often the case, the poor disproportionately suffer because we don't take proper law enforcement action.
Thank you, Senator. 30 seconds, Representative Ortiz, and then we'll move on to the next question.
I would like to get back to what Senator Kavanaugh just argued about babies that are separated from their parents and being put into foster care. It sounds as though he's alluding to returning to a time which we saw under the Trump administration when families were separated. There were thousands of children taken from their parents, many of whom to this day have not been reunited with their parents. Imagine that. I am an auntie to 6 kids, and I cannot even fathom the idea of my niece or my nephew, or let alone my own child, being taken away from me and never being able to see them again because the United States government has lost them. That is the reality, trauma that we will be paying for generations. And he wants more of that. I say absolutely not.
Thank you, Senator. I do want to get back to these questions on Proposition 314. Given the proximity to the border, elected leaders and local law enforcement agencies in Southern Arizona have publicly stated concerns that the burden of enforcing the immigration provisions within Proposition 314 will fall largely on their shoulders. Senator, what is your response to these concerns?
Number one, nobody can force a law enforcement officer to make an arrest. It's up to them. We hope that they would, because they took an oath to uphold the law. Number two, a Democrat sheriff and a Democrat mayor doesn't mean there's a groundswell of opposition to this bill. As a matter of fact, the Arizona Sheriff's Association supports this bill. Law enforcement supports this bill because they're boots on the ground. They're the people that see the victims of these criminals and dangerous people who are crossing between illegal points of entry and victimizing people. And they want to help stop it.
Representative Ortiz, 2 minutes.
I heard from sheriffs, including the president of the Sheriff's Association, who came to testify before our committee as we debated this bill. And they told me that they do not have the resources for this and that they are incredibly concerned that there is no funding attached to it. So we are asking local law enforcement to be Arizona's own duplicate border patrol without giving them any funding or training. And that is why Cochise County Attorney, a Republican, Brian McIntyre, has said in his own words, this is unconstitutional and unenforceable. Our local law enforcement is going to have to make tough choices. Our local cities and towns are going to have to decide, are we going to raise taxes on people, or are we going to be okay with having less public safety resources because this egregious Proposition 314 is demanding so much of local law enforcement, which should not fall on their backs. It is the role of the federal government, and that is why we need to work with Congress to get something done in Washington.
30 seconds, Senator.
I have to keep repeating myself, right? Nothing in this bill requires any law enforcement agency to do anything. We rely on their basic commitment to enforcing the law. Now, I've been in the legislature for 18 years. Every year in the Appropriations Committee, more often than not as the chair. Anytime we pass a bill, everybody comes in and says, give us some more money. And you know what? We will. We've already given $59 million for this type of enforcement. And you know, if we're picking up human traffickers, drug dealers, criminals who've been evicted, no amount of money is a barrier to protecting Arizona residents.
Thank you, Senator. Do you agree with that?
There is nothing in the language of this law that requires anyone crossing to be, as he claims, dangerous. This is going to have broad, wide-ranging effects on our community, and it is going to impact the vast majority of people who are crossing into our country who are simply seeking asylum: families, children, women. And let me remind you that Stanford University and the conservative Cato Institute have done numerous studies that have shown people without documentation are far less likely to commit crimes than U.S.-born citizens. So don't fall for this fear-mongering.
Thank you.
Representative Ortiz, we'll return to that in a moment, but I want to ask for ideas from you, whether it is an invasion or a crisis, whether that's hyperbole or rhetoric or not. There are people, I presume some of your constituents, who are thinking to themselves, I'd like there to be something that Arizona can do to help in some of these situations when it comes to immigration enforcement, whether it comes to border security. Do you have any ideas on the Democratic side of the aisle that you would like to posit that would be better than Proposition 314?
Well, just this past budget, Steve, we allocated additional funding for drug interdiction efforts on the border. I think that's incredibly important, especially because more than 90% of the fentanyl being smuggled into the United States is coming through legal ports of entry. So that is something that we can allocate additional funding to modernize technology at the border. We also allocated more money for those local rural border communities and their law enforcement to be able to address any issues that they're dealing with. But fundamentally, we have to address this, because if we don't address the root issues, the problems with our asylum process, the backlogs, the lack of immigration judges, we are going to continue being in this same exact position.
Senator Kevin, I want to ask a direct question, though. Yes, of course, but a direct question first. And that is, we often hear every legislative session the majority doesn't work with the minority on the budget, for example. Was the majority open to ideas from the Democratic side of the aisle that Representative Ortiz is bringing up, or was it really, we're Republican, this is how we're going to do it?
Well, for the last 2 years, since we have a Democrat governor, we have an entirely new dynamic at the state capitol. And we work very closely with Governor Hobbs, who coordinates with the Democrats. So to the extent that Governor Hobbs respected them and had their input, they were in the game.
Okay. Representative
Can I
Ortiz?
reply
Of
to the
course,
statement?
yes, sure.
You know, we keep talking about this 90% of the fentanyl comes in through the ports of entry. That's not true. No one can say that 90% of the fentanyl comes in through the ports of entry because we don't know how much fentanyl is coming in other places. When you have virtually no Border Patrol agents in between the ports of entry to stop fentanyl smugglers, there could be a mountain of fentanyl going in there. So maybe it's only 10% at the crossings, but the actual product coming in is coming in between the crossings, and that's what we need to stop. This fentanyl is killing people. It's killing our kids. It's turning them into vegetables in the hospital. I do not understand why my Democrat colleagues don't want to put up some cash to stop this smuggling.
Senator, with the topic of fentanyl, as you alluded to, since the majority of seizures, at least the things that are being detected, do happen at the ports of entry, can you explain how Proposition 314 would address this fentanyl epidemic and how it would change the trafficking situation?
Sure. It will help in two ways. Number one, we're going to have all law enforcement, right, that wants to. They're going to be apprehending people crossing between the ports of entry, people who, because they're smuggling fentanyl perhaps, aren't going to the port of entry with their backpack of fentanyl trying to sneak through. So we'll stop that fentanyl from coming in. And when the smugglers know we have cops between the border places, they won't put the drugs through there, or it'll reduce the amount. So you're going to dramatically reduce the amount of fentanyl coming in between the ports of entry. And then we're going to deter people from selling fentanyl. We're going to enhance the penalty for selling fentanyl when you know it's fentanyl and you sell it knowing it's fentanyl and you kill somebody. Somebody dies because of it. Somebody's child, somebody's husband, somebody's grandkid. This is a tragedy, and we need to spend some cash to shut that border down from fentanyl, and that's what this proposition does.
Representative, do you believe that Proposition 314 would address the fentanyl crisis here in Arizona?
Absolutely not. In fact, it gives a false sense of security or a false sense that we are doing something about the fentanyl crisis. Again, the vast majority of this coming over is coming from U.S. citizens, and we have to address the demand side. There is no proposal in here that would provide prevention or rehabilitation for Arizona's serious drug crisis. Now, one of the things that is so frustrating to me is that there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that harsher penalties or increased mandatory minimum sentences would deter drug use or drug sales. What we do know is that when people are locked away in the State Department of Corrections, they don't have access to the treatment that they need, and they come home sometimes sicker than when they went in. So we have to address the drug treatment, the prevention, and the rehabilitation, and that is something that I would really love to see more of an investment from our state.
Senator, what about the demand? What can you respond to that?
When drug smugglers, when human traffickers, when people with serious criminal records who shouldn't be re-entering this country are apprehended by local law enforcement under the provisions of this proposition and are in prison, they will not be victimizing people. They will not be smuggling more drugs in. They will not be smuggling in women for prostitution. So it's money well spent.
30 seconds, Representative Ortiz.
Again, there's absolutely nothing in this bill that would ensure that law enforcement is only going after those folks. We would see a huge increase in our population in the Department of Corrections of people who have a right under federal law to seek asylum here. And many of those folks are simply passing through Arizona to await their fair day in court. And now we're saying we want them to stay here locked up in the Department of Corrections at an estimated $250 million that DOC estimates on top of their billion-dollar budget. I don't see how that's going to solve very much of anything.
10 seconds.
Running out of time.
But once again, Representative Ortiz, I don't think she's read the bill.
I have read the bill, sir.
The bill clearly states that if you are a first-time offender, you haven't crossed before, and if you are eligible to apply for asylum, You are released. You do not go to prison. You get to go through the regular system. She didn't read the bill.
Okay,
I did read the bill, sir.
Okay, I want to bring this back to a philosophical question. Earlier in the debate, you brought up the word emotionalism, which for a lot of people, and you were saying the Democrats do that, Senator, a lot of people are saying that the feeling about a crisis for the general public has to do with certain cable networks, shall we say, and people are watching things and they're getting emotionally amped up as well. How is it possible for the issue of undocumented immigration, illegal immigration, not to be emotional?
Well, again, this is not about undocumented immigration, right? This is primarily about getting some enforcement between the lawful entry points to get rid of the really bad people. Now, it does have the issue of taking away benefits from people and penalizing people who try to get jobs, right, and take jobs away from Americans. Is losing a job emotional? Is watching 5,000 people in a caravan on TV coming up to the country to, I guess I'll use the word invade? Yeah. And it is emotional, and people should be emotional. This is a serious crisis.
Representative Ortiz?
Look, Senator Kavanaugh sponsored what is now known and recognized as one of the most embarrassing mistakes in our state's history in SB 1070. This does something incredibly similar to SB 1070, and it will have wide-ranging impacts. It will allow police to arrest, detain, and deport anyone in any part of the state, including babies and children. He sold us a bill of goods with SB 1070, claiming that it would make our neighborhoods safer, when all it did was terrorize families and devastate our economy, leading to national boycotts. We cannot and we should not fall for these same failed policies that for some reason he thinks are going to be different this time around.
SB 1070 was a wildly popular bill. The polls showed the people supported it because illegal immigration was a serious problem. In addition, SB 1070's key provision, the right of police with reasonable suspicion to detain people they thought were in the country illegally for ICE, was upheld by the Supreme Court. In addition, the ban on sanctuary cities was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. Can you imagine if we could have sanctuary cities? I wouldn't be surprised if Tucson would become a sanctuary city, maybe even Phoenix. And then the same problems that are plaguing sanctuary cities in California, New York City, we'd have here. God bless SB 1070. It saved us a lot of grief, and I am proud to have helped write part of it, to have co-sponsored it, and to have voted for it.
30-second response. Representative.
It's shameful. It's shameful that we are still here debating these failed policies, that we have families whose lives will never be the same because they were traumatized under SB 1070. Their families were torn apart. You know, this bill, Prop 314, it will allow police to arrest and detain someone until they can prove their citizenship, right? This means that there will be Arizona citizens who are unlawfully detained, potentially put in a jail cell until they can prove their citizenship. It is a return to the show me your papers law, and that experience is incredibly traumatizing and dehumanizing for folks. Prop 314 also offers immunity to those law enforcement officers who may have committed racial profiling or discrimination, meaning that us, the citizens, have no way to fight back and protect our civil rights.
We actually have no more time, Senator. Apologize. It's time for closing statements. Each of you have 1 minute, and to keep us on time, we'll politely cut you off if you run over. John Kavanaugh, you have the first closing statement. You have 1 minute, sir.
Thank you. Look, the opponents of this bill are doing everything they can to confuse and obfuscate the voters. They're trying to make it sound like this is some massive statewide immigration roundup. They're downplaying the dangers between the crossings of terrorists, criminals, gang members, human traffickers. They want to stay willfully blind of the horror that is occurring at our border. And I don't think the voters should fall for it. I think the voters need to support public safety. And that's what this is all about. This is about public safety and about protecting the taxpayer's pocketbook from people who don't deserve to get benefits from getting them. It's a very simple, very well-focused, very protective, good public safety law.
Okay. Annalise Ortiz, you have 1 minute for your closing statement.
Proposition 314 is an anti-public safety bill. It's why local law enforcement from border communities have opposed this measure and came to testify before the state legislature to say, we do not have the resources. If Prop 314 passes, we will be forced to choose between solving robberies and assaults in your neighborhoods and playing the role, duplicating the role of Border Patrol without any training or any funding attached to it. If this passes, it will be incredibly expensive for the taxpayer. And us as lawmakers, we're going to have to decide, do we raise taxes or do we be okay with the fact that people are going to have less public safety resources in their communities? Proposition 314 will return us to a time where I could be arrested and detained and questioned because of the color of my skin or the suspicion that I do not belong in the state where I was born and raised. Securing the border is the job of the federal government. And we know that if Congress passes the border package that's already there, it will be signed by Kamala Harris. This is bad for business. Vote no on Prop 314.
That's all the time we have today. That wraps up today's debate for Proposition 314. As a reminder, Arizona's general election is on Tuesday, November 5th, and early voting starts on Wednesday, October 9th. There are a lot of offices up for election this year, so we'll keep hosting debates through the fall. Head to azmedia.org to see a full list of upcoming debates and where you can find them on TV, radio, and digital platforms provided by our local media partners.
For the full debate schedule and to submit questions for future debates, head to azcleanelections.gov. And on behalf of our partners at Clean Elections, the Arizona Media Association, Reister, and Bitfire Studios, thanks for joining us.